of The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And as a preview to the series, Humphrey Carpenter describes how it came to be written as he guides us past watchful dragons.
Can we just describe the action for Perry, please? Could I have a little hand?
Hush, everyone.
Quiet, everywhere.
Nice and quiet. Smile the lights, everyone. Very quiet.
Here comes the plane.
Can you run up to record, please, George?
We're up to speak.
We are recording. Nice and quiet.
Stand by.
Smoke up, Steve.
Action. You, Leslie.
You, Leslie.
Cue Mr. Beaver.
But now the Aslan is on the move.
Do it from please start again.
Try one more.
Here we go again.
Because it's wide shot.
Let's try it with all the heads on. If Beaver's head's off.
Come to me, evil! All who's evil works for me! Nya! Nya! Nya!
The naked beaver.
That's all right. I think we'll just give them a break.
Yeah, roast beef.
I couldn't eat another thing.
Gosh, what a lovely meal.
Stop recording.
Hold it now. Stop recording. Stop recording.
Well, if you're wondering what all that was about, you can find out next Sunday by watching the first episode of C.S. Lewis's famous fantasy, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It's one of the 7 Narnia books for children that he wrote in the late 1940s and early 1950s when he was teaching here at Magdalen College, Oxford. Narnia is C.S. Lewis's magical world, a bit like Alice's Wonderland, lived in by talking animals like Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and Mr. Tumnus the Fawn.
Excuse me,
Goodness gracious.
are you a fawn?
In Narnia, it's permanently winter because it's ruled by a wicked queen in the shape of the White Witch on her sleigh.
And what, pray, are you?
She has a rival, a lion with deep magical power to bring about miraculous transformations. C.S. Lewis was one of the most popular writers this century, and not just for children. As well as the 7 Narnia stories, he wrote books about literature and about the world we live in and whether there might be other worlds before or after it. He was born in Belfast in the north of Ireland in November 1898. As a boy, his closest friend was his elder brother, Warren. When he was only 8, his mother died tragically of cancer. It took the 2 boys and their father years to recover from this shattering blow. Young Lewis, or Jack as he called himself, was a great reader even then. He especially liked the Beatrix Potter stories, and Squirrel Nutkin was his favourite character.
I liked the Beatrix Potter illustrations at a time when the idea of humanized animals fascinated me perhaps even more than it fascinates most children.
He liked the animal cartoons by the artist Tenniel in Punch magazine, and reading stories about the Knights of the Round Table and the court of King Arthur. He started writing and illustrating animal fantasy stories of his own, all set in the make-believe world of Animal Land. And when his brother came home from boarding school, the 2 of them got together and drew elaborate maps of a whole imaginary continent they called Boxen. The Boxen stories are a kind of simplified version of the more magical land of Narnia he created nearly 40 years later. When he was sent away to a private tutor, he found he could read as many fantasies and legends as he liked, such as Arthur Rackham's editions of German myths and medieval stories like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And when he learned Latin and Greek, he tackled Homer's great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. His tutor, Mr. Kirkpatrick, said he's read more classics than any boy I ever had. That's how Jack Lewis came here to Oxford as a student. He got first-class honours in 3 subjects. He became a don, a teacher in the university, and he was soon an expert in the sort of medieval and mythological literature that he loved. But all the time he was teaching here, he was hatching his own fantasy stories. People won't write the kind of books I want, he said, so I'll have to do it myself. The outbreak of war in 1939 gave Lewis a setting for these stories. Thousands of children were evacuated, sent out from the big cities to keep them safe from bombing. And when 4 evacuee schoolgirls arrived at Lewis's home in Oxford, he started the first version of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
This book is about 4 children whose names were Anne, Martin, Rose and Peter. But it is most about Peter, who was the youngest. They all had to go away from London suddenly because of air raids. They were sent to stay with a kind of relation of mother's who was a very old professor who lived all by himself in the country.
That's how they found themselves in another world, Narnia. With the right sound effects, it's fairly easy to bring the Narnia stories alive on radio.
Oh, here they come again. Where now?
Let's get into the wardrobe until they've passed. No one will follow us in here.
Want a bed?
Do be quiet, Edmund.
See?
Quick, there's nowhere else. Into the wardrobe.
You can do whatever you like with animation, and so it's not surprising that there's an American The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe cartoon. But trying to recreate Narnia with live actors on television is much more difficult, though the independent ABC company did a remarkably good job in 1968. The writer who adapted that ITV production was Trevor Preston. Did he think it was an ambitious thing to do at the time?
It was meant to be a sort of storyteller to camera to some extent. And then the production team said, well, we could illustrate that a little bit, couldn't we? And then it grew and grew and grew and grew. And I suppose in terms of children's drama, then yes, it was ambitious.
21 years later, the BBC has been able to give the writer of this latest adaptation, Alan Seymour, far more resources to play with.
The great joy of being a writer, of course, is the freedom you have writing something like this. You just sit there and you put down the words on the page, conjure up the most incredibly difficult and complicated effects, and you know that you don't have to solve that problem. You're setting a problem for producer, director, or the effects departments to cope with later on.
So it's still an ambitious project today, and a costly one too, as producer Paul Stone explains.
Well, obviously, as it will be apparent, it's an expensive programme. But in order to make this kind of programme, you really got to have backing of either an independent co-producer or, unfortunately in this case, we're being partly financed by BBC Enterprises.
Pamela Lonsdale, who produced the ABC version, wasn't quite so well off.
Well, originally it was on a very low budget because it was to be just a Jackanory type presentation with really only a small set and a few pictures. We increased the budget and increased the budget, and I think we ended up at the sort of princely sum of something like £1,000 or £1,200 an episode. That was quite a lot then. I mean, now, I doubt if you'd pay for a costume.
In his final version, Lewis called the characters Peter, Susan, Edmund and Lucy. Auditions were last November.
Right. The first thing we're going to do is warm up a bit, because I'm sure you're all sitting there feeling very anxious and nervous and worried and butterflies in the tummy and...
When Richard Dempsey, Sophie Cook, Jonathan Scott and Sophie Wilcox got the parts, they soon found themselves in Narnia, or rather somewhere in the Cairngorms outside Aviemore in Scotland in February. Miles from the nearest town, a long drive up a single-track road in filthy weather on the edge of a frozen loch. BBC Scenic Construction had already spent 3 weeks there building Mr. and Mrs. Beaver's house.
Well, all 4 children have now arrived in Narnia together. They've met up with Mr. Beaver, who is a messenger from Mr. Tumnus, and he has promised to take them home with him to have some dinner, which, as they're feeling rather hungry, is obviously very exciting for them.
Ah, here we are. And it looks as though Mrs. Beaver is expecting us.
The script actually says they arrive at the dam. Below the dam is more ice, but this has been frozen into foamy, wavy shapes. And most magnificent of all, where the water has fallen over the dam, there is a glittering wall of icicles. On the far side of the dam stands a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive. From a hole in the roof, smoke rises, which makes them all think of cooking and food and their hunger. So this was the brief.
In the book, Edmund disappears from the meal, and the other 3 children go outside to look for him. Shooting even a straightforward scene like that in the Cairngorms in February posed its own particular problems.
Otherwise, it seemed okay.
Well, these are skin-coloured tights, and when you see them on the screen, they look like my real legs. But when they got close-ups, we've got to take our thermals off and our tights off.
And wear our sandals. We've got these as well. They're like tea bags. You put them in your pocket and they warm up.
It's just so cold. You're togged up. Got so many layers of clothing on, you can't move.
Lots and lots of layers. Build up layers underneath the waterproof stuff, and it tends to keep you warm. It's the hands that get cold first. You feel the fingers start to go tingly and numb.
Well, when I'm working, I think I'm pumping out so much adrenaline, I don't notice it. It's when I stop that I realise my fingers are very cold.
As soon as I start jogging up and down, if I have any walking to do in the scene, it's like a sauna in there. I ask everybody else what the weather's like, and they say it's freezing, and I say, well, it's boiling in here. I have to...
How's that looking on camera?
I have to take the weight of my whole body on my hands in this scene because I'm crouching down to fish. Well, you feel sort of like you're encased in concrete. It's not very easy. I mean, the first few days I fell over about half a dozen times. And it takes about 4 people to get me back upright.
There are clearly huge problems because in writing the characters of the animals, and Lewis wrote into them human characteristics, human emotions, human feelings, and therefore we had to pick more than just an animal. But in the case of the beavers, it would be quite impossible to reproduce them in a naturalistic form and still have actors playing the part.
I can't lean forward too far without, as we discussed, falling over.
See how far forward you can go without falling.
Can you balance yourself on one hand?
We decided that the animal should walk on 2 legs, and I suppose we were slightly influenced by Pauline Bain's excellent illustrations in the book. The faces of the animals were masks, sort of half masks. You could actually see their mouths move. The lower parts of their faces were actually made up to the same colour, like the beavers had very dark makeup.
Ah, goodness me, it's nothing.
Is it, Mrs. Beaver? You look as if you have a secret.
Oh, it's no secret. They've got him.
Can you run up to record, please, George? Beaver retriever, stand by. Okay, we are recording. Nice and quiet. This is 307. Shot 1, take 1.
Very still on it.
Got one.
But sometimes the conditions made it impossible to shoot at all.
What do you think, Cliff?
I honestly think that there's too much weather, too many trees. We can't bring artists up here in this. It's just not going to be safe for them.
We might be able to get a few cutaways of the ice, and the trouble is snow's going down the lens, and it's a bit difficult to get anything in this wind because it's swirling.
If we go back, have maybe some lunch even.
Yeah.
Okay. Come back again afterwards, see if it's decreased a bit.
Yeah.
This one, please.
Oh, I'll have the soup, please, and lasagna.
What do beavers have for location lunch?
A bit of birch and maple. Maple's good. Maple was off the other day, but I hear it's on again today.
No vegetables.
Well, what's the verdict, Cliff?
Well, it's wet and there's not much snow down there, but we think with a lot of foam and a lot of angles, we can probably make it work.
They get the water from the lake and they mix it in with all the additives, which is basically seaweed, so it's good for the environment as well. And then spray it on, and as you can see, when it begins to melt, close up it doesn't work very well, but in the long shots it seems to give us a good cover.
Just these front logs are in shot, so disperse them in seaweed foam.
Start to sort of move forward. We only lost half a day. We've been very lucky up to now. If you're desperately trying to complete a scene and the light's beginning to drop, it always seems as if the most complicated shot is at the end of the day. You try and plan so that you know you're getting everything that you need to get to make it cut together. If you haven't got one particular shot, sometimes you can't make it work.
Still recording.
It was a very small amount of film because Trevor and I felt that all the reality, all the house should be for real, and that Narnia should be much more stylized, which was our studio side. We had the most ingenious young designer who managed to beg, borrow and steal all sorts of bits and sheets and cover it with snow, and I think it looked very effective.
Go as quickly as you can.
The snow looked okay, you know, we did the best we could, but we tried to do a whole production where the child was actually asked to contribute their imagination to the piece.
For the new production, the interior of the Beaver's house was in the studio.
Mrs. Beaver, I found them. Here are the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve.
The children had to run out to look for Edmund all over again, only this time the problem was keeping cool.
So far, so good. We're just trying to figure out the mechanics of keeping us cooled down, and this is one of the rare times I'm going to be able to take my beaver head off, but it doesn't make it any easier.
Right, stand by then, fans down.
Well, it's too warm actually. I mean, the contrast is amazing. I mean, we're freezing when we're in Scotland and we're boiling when we're here.
Well, it's sort of like sitting in a warm bath, really. It's sort of wet and warm, and you know, I feel like I'm sort of doing the beaver paddle. It's very hot.
And another problem was making it all fit with what they'd done 2 months ago.
I was slightly concerned about the fact that the studio set is fractionally bigger than it was on location, particularly with the camera actually tends to make things look bigger rather than smaller. It's a circular set, so the shooting is forced to be around a circle. So what we decided was to build a set which was in segments, pieces pulled out like pieces of cheese, so that you could actually work right the way around the set.
It's actually a very nice set to shoot.
The set's very disorienting. Once you've taken one section of it out, it's very difficult to work out where everything was before you took it out.
Sue?
Yes, please.
What order should they come through the door?
Right, Mr. Beaver, Lucy, Susan, Peter and Edmund.
Well, it's a bit confusing because the last time I actually shot any footage was 4 or 5 weeks ago. But I am quite into the character of Mr. Beaver.
I love you, son of Adam. What a simple thing to say. Turn him to stone? Why, if she can stand on her 2 feet and look him in the face, it'll be the most she can do and more than I expect. No, he'll put all to rights.
As it says in an old rhyme in these parts.
Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again.
Very well done.
Very well done.
It was close. Just do one more. I think, given all the importance of those speeches, we must do it again. I mean, there's too much at stake on that. Are we off for time?
Well, getting very behind.
Are we?
Do you want one more go?
Try one more. I thought it was just a little bit...
The production team had to get every mention of Aslan the lion absolutely right.
It's starting to really come strong now, and we think it's worth keeping it going.
And the character of Aslan was just as important to C.S. Lewis.
I don't know where the lion came from or why he came, but once he was there, he pulled the whole story together, and soon he pulled the other 6 Narnia stories in after him.
I just did it the way I saw it in the book. Luckily, we had the person that made the costumes, they really were superb, and Aslan looked really quite terrifying.
Fall back. All of you! I want to speak to the witch alone.
And there was one marvellous drawing towards the end of the book where the lion is walking away with the witch to make the bargain about Edmund's life. That looked so effective that the designer decided that we would have him on 2 legs. Aslan had a full mane, but again the mask ended there and it was just hair on his chin.
The traditional way was clearly an actor standing up with a head mask on, and I wanted to avoid that. So in a curious way, no logic, but I felt that Aslan had to have the majesty of a real animal, and yet it must speak more than that.
Who is Aslan?
Who is? Wait, don't you know? He's the king.
Aslan seems to be what anybody would like to make of him. If you're an Orthodox Christian, I guess Aslan is the Christ figure. And the sequence we're doing here tonight, when the lion is executed by the Wicked Witch, It's an equivalent to the crucifixion. Now, you don't have to know that to appreciate the story.
Is he a man?
Aslan, a man? Certainly not. I tell you, he is king of the wood. Why, don't you know who is the king of beasts?
You mean a lion?
One of the episodes ends with them children being brought to this place on top of the hill that is Aslan's camp, and they see him for the first time in his majesty, and they are brought to the full realization of his power and his kindness.
Sometimes you have to find ways of solving problems other than spending a great deal of money and a great deal of time on them. We did this by the use of the narrator, which is a specific character from the book, the Professor. It could be seen, I suppose, as a way of getting round doing the magic, which it was to some extent.
Now! I think there is one section where the witch and the dwarf were turned into a boulder and a tree. We did try to do it, and the effect was not good enough, so we were able to use Jack Woolgar as the Professor.
Well, now, if you'd kept on looking, you would realize that there was something very odd about the stump and the boulder. And if you'd gone on watching, when everything had gone quite quiet, you would have seen the boulder move over to the stump and start talking to it.
Are you all right, Your Majesty?
Of course I am, you stunted fool!
The important thing with any effect is the planning that takes place beforehand. So when we go on to location, we have to take, in this case, 3 specific shots. One, we first set in the tree and the boulder into the right places. We then take out the tree and set the queen in so she's looking the same as the tree, in the same position. And we then set the little man to match the same position as the boulder. We then take out the queen and the little man and shoot just the empty background. We then bring it into the workshop here, and we have the tree. We take the boulder, which is via the slide file, and key it over the empty shot. And the effect is relatively simple. If I just cue everything up now, and off we go. So you start with the shot with the tree and the boulder superimposed on top, and then it will go through from that to the original location shoot with the action on it.
In a world where characters are often changing shape, Robin needs help from a gadget called the paint box. For Aslan to bring these statues back to life, first they recorded the shot of the horse and girl on location. Then the paint box artist drew on the stone texture. Aslan's breath was created by a smoke gun in the studio, and when Robin puts all 3 ingredients together in the workshop, the effect is probably very close to what C.S. Lewis had in mind. Manorbier Castle in South Wales was the location for the witch's castle. In his final rescue mission, Aslan flies in carrying Susan and Lucy on his back. His point of view was shot by a remote-controlled camera mounted on a crane high above the castle wall. Another picture for him to land into was shot at ground level on the other side of the wall. And Aslan himself, carrying the 2 children, was recorded in an empty studio with a neutral background. The flying was done by programming a video computer to move him diagonally across the screen. Then, when all the technical equipment had been blotted out, Aslan was finally able to fly over the castle wall.
We didn't attempt to see Aslan flying with the children. Then there was absolutely no way that we could actually show that and make it work. And I think that the words, C.S. Lewis's words that Trevor used for the Professor, told it all.
But what's it all about, this adventure of magic and intrigue in a make-believe world? What does it really mean? Is it just a children's fantasy, or is there more to it than that? To start answering that question, it helps to know that C.S. Lewis, while he was teaching here at Oxford, became a believing Christian. I think that could be quite a help in starting to understand the story.
A children's story which is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story.
Very young children can read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and middle-aged children and very, very elderly 70-year-old children can read it, and all get something different from those books.
So is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe simply the Christian story dressed up with talking animals, what we call an allegory, with the wicked witch as the devil and Aslan as Jesus Christ? Or is there still another way of looking at it?
Some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children. This is all pure moonshine. I couldn't write that way at all. Everything began as images. A fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion.
But basically, it's a very strong Christian piece, and humanist piece as well, if you don't happen to be a Christian. And I think it can be enjoyed, loved, several different levels.
These children start in this most innocent little adventure when they're in an empty room in a house. The only piece of furniture in the room is an old wardrobe, and because they want to hide from adults, they're not too keen to see, they'll pile into the wardrobe, and the next thing they've gone through the clothes in the wardrobe and they're out into open space and into a magic land, Narnia. That in itself, of course, is wonderful. That takes us from the domestic and the familiar into something totally strange. But, of course, it's like life itself. It's full of challenges for them, and the different children respond in different ways, and we get to learn something about each one's personality and how they either get along together or conflict with each other.
Are we going the right way? Shouldn't we be bearing a little more that way if we're heading for the lamp post?
So you were here, and all the time you made out Lucy was telling lies. Of all the poisonous little beasts.
So what Lewis did was to write a fairy tale. But because he knew so much about the myths of the Greeks and the Romans, the Norsemen and the knights of King Arthur, it came out as a very special sort of fairy tale indeed. In fact, what he wrote was his own myth. Mr. Tumnus, the faun, and all the other satyrs, oreads and centaurs could easily come from Greek tales like the Iliad and the Odyssey. The stone table where Aslan has his camp could be from a legend of King Arthur, and you could easily find the talking animals like the beavers in Aesop's Fables or Beatrix Potter. The myths of every age, whether they're Greek or Roman or medieval, tell us an enormous amount about the character and interests of the people who lived in those times, the things that mattered to them, family life or obeying the gods or behaving with chivalry. Now, C.S. Lewis created a fairy tale, a myth that in that sort of way tells us what was important to the times he lived in, and also tells us even more what was important to him.
I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Supposing by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, could one not steal past to those watchful dragons? I thought one could.
Part 1 of The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis begins next Sunday on BBC One at 5:40.
On one night last November,